otherwise, I would invite Barbara to step forward again and, well, introduce us to the agricultural case, which is led by FRB. And Uba, sorry, forgot about that.
Should come in a few minutes. So while waiting for that, that's the only workshop that you will not be able to attend during this conference. And it has been explained partly because I moved back from UK, where I was working with Andrew Poulin on the prototype, back to France in Paris to FRB, when I'm now working at testing the prototype I've contributed to design. So it's a kind of conflict of interest. So I'm really motivated to do my best to prove that this prototype can work. And actually, it's going to be a huge challenge because the agriculture case studies is a very interesting one because I'm not from an agricultural background. And my colleagues in these case studies, Cécile Blanc from FRB and Peter Zulka, are not experts in agriculture. So we're working almost as a knowledge coordinating body, and we will need to obtain the help from experts, that's for sure, to be able to accomplish this work. But let's go back to the question itself, and you have a sort of question already in the title of this slide. But how did we come to that? Well, my colleagues Cécile and Aurélien Carbonnière from FRB and Peter Zulka, before I joined FRB, really negotiated, asked when to meet the Ministry of Agriculture in the respective countries. They also contacted DG Environment, DG Agriculture, and they've tried to ask them what would be a question you would ask to the NoK. And that's a very difficult exercise. Let's remember that normally they would come naturally to the NoK with a concern or a question. And here you have to knock the doors and ask them, do you have a question? And they're not ready for that at all. So it took quite a lot of time to try to get a question that was suitable to a case study. And finally, this topic of pesticides was acknowledged as something of European interest. So it was suitable for the NoK. And there was an agreement from different DGs and ministries that it was something useful for and of policy relevance. And here is a typical question that we got from a policymaker. I won't give any name, but you see that it's very broad. It's a concern, and the first thing we've done as a KCB is to initiate the dialogue and initiate the analysis of the request to make sure that we were understanding the request and we could tackle this request. And actually, we immediately say, no, it's too broad. And you see the first part of the request is actually a statement. It's an assumption that if you decrease pesticides, you expect to restore the population of natural predators or competitors of pests. And that could deserve already a kind of systematic review. Is there insurance? Is there evidence that it's true? But it's not, if you read the question a second time, it's not the question that is asked by this policymaker or decision maker. The real question, and it's well phrased, is is there any landscape management intervention that could sustain or improve this ecosystem service provided to agriculture? And they want to have a list of these interventions. But what's the point in asking a NoK for just a list of interventions? You can ask a consulting agency to do that, or you can scope the literature. So we moved this thinking a bit forward, and we said, you just don't want a list. You want to know what are the different interventions, but which ones are working, are effective, and which ones don't work, or nobody's sure about that. So we worked again and again on this question because we wanted to narrow it. And finally, we transformed it into something a little bit more simpler, which is which types of landscape management are effective at maintaining or increasing natural pest regulation in a context of decreased use of pesticides. And it's still very broad, but we say, let's play the game so far, because that's obviously the question asked to the NoK. I want to give you a little bit of of insight about the context, and this comes from the scoping exercise I will tell you more about. We have cultures, orchards and crops cultivated all over the world, and the problem is that they are attacked by pests. And these pests already, you see that we have a huge diversity of pests, birds, weeds, diseases. Which kind of interventions on the landscape do we want to organize? Which kind of pests do we want to control? All of them or some of them? Obviously, the request is all of them, but I'm not sure we'll have the time to tackle that. So we may have to narrow the request to tackle only one type of pest. That's getting back to the requester and asking him or her, what exactly do you want? What are the means, the resources you put in the study? If there is little resource, we can't do a broad, we can't answer a broad question. So for pesticides, that's another problem. You have a whole range of pesticides for different pests. Which type of decrease of pesticides? Is it a general decrease of the use of pesticides or a selective decrease? You have all sorts of things that you can tackle in the literature. Many farmers still use pesticides, but not all of them, because some of the molecules have been forbidden. So what does it mean, a decrease in the context of a decrease of pesticides? How much decrease? Which kind of pesticides? This needs clarification, because otherwise it's very big. It's okay, but you put more resource if you want the answer at the broad scale. And then you have the context. The context is that you want to decrease the pesticides, the use of pesticides, because of health concerns, because of their impact on health of farmers and people living around, and also because of their impact on biodiversity. And the idea was to use ecosystem services, and especially the natural predators or competitors or parasitoids or diseases provided by nature. And so far, the tendency, the management intervention was to release, to captive bred some predators, for instance, and to release them into the wild. It has been criticized because it was not natural, and sometimes it was invasive species or exotic species released, or interfering with natural pests in terms of genetics. So there has been a lot of controversy. So the idea now is to go back to a more natural thing by supporting natural indigenous population of pest control agents or helpers, acting as helpers of the farmers, and not by releasing them, but by managing the habitat so that the habitat favors these natural populations of predators or competitors. But there are other things when you scope the literature. You can also manage the habitat so that you create a habitat that is more attractive to the pests than the crop or the culture itself. Or you can create a habitat or manage a habitat so that it's full of repellents, so that the pests never go in the crop, because there is a barrier of repellent plants or a structure that prevents them to fly or jump or whatever into the crops. So what does it mean, habitat management? You have all sorts of options. And how do we know that, not being experts? Because we've done some scoping of the literature to see what was there. And we've asked some experts. And we played the game. We launched the call to the NoK, telling them what we would do and that we wanted to gather expertise and knowledge about all that. And we launched first about 600 mails using the hubs that were identified by Estelle and her team. So it was very inappropriate because many hubs were marine or not at all related to agriculture, but you never know. They may know other people. And actually, as for Stefan, the feedback was very poor. We had 1 or 2 answers saying, oh yeah, actually I'm not an expert, but you could contact this person. Very, very little feedback. Let's remember that it's a call launched from personal emails. It's not flagged IP base or whatever, or DG environment. So it arrives in a among a bunch of emails every day, and probably many people just discarded that email. They've never heard about that, so it's one more project. So what's the point? And indeed, when some of us contacted directly, or we targeted our email campaign more closely, and we narrowed it to experts, we launched about 300 emails again to experts this time, and we got the help and really good feedback from Alternet, I must say. We get many more expressions of interest. People were not eager to say, yeah, I want to contribute, but they were, keep me informed, or I have some knowledge, or I know some people. So we started to build up a list of experts, and I think we have about 35 experts emails right now, people expressing interest. But it was much too early to organize a workshop. Nobody was available to be there today. So it was, we delayed this workshop, and we intend to organize one in September and gather as many people as possible. In parallel, while we were waiting for all these people to answer, we've scoped the literature. So we've done some very broad search in Web of Knowledge and Scopus and Biosys with very broad search terms. So we've gathered about 6,000 hits, but there is a lot of irrelevant literature, so we have to screen that. It takes a lot of time, and that's why we were much concerned about time and limited resources. That's why we try to rely on experts rather than this bibliography, but we may have to come back to that. But it allowed us to get a better insight of what we may have at the end, and how diverse this question is, and what it means by pest and pesticides and so on. It was nevertheless a very useful exercise, because we identified a few reviews, and some of them were sent by authors themselves, and especially two very recent reviews and a meta-analysis that have been conducted and published in 2011. And those reviews were about landscape management, but they were not really answering the questions, because although they provide evidence, and most of them have been conducted according to some systematic review guidelines, very interesting, they are reporting about the proportion of natural habitat compared to the proportion of cultivated habitat that is relevant to support natural pests, but they are not telling us what kind of habitats, how the composition of these habitats. Is there a lot of trees or bushes, or what kind of plants, or what kind of structure of the habitat? So it's not really answering the question that has been asked to the NoK. In parallel, using Google and using all these experts, we identified many projects going on related to pesticides. In France, we have Ecophyto 2018 with the target of decreasing pesticides by 50% by 2018. So there are many people involved in these projects, because if you decrease pesticides, you have to replace that by something else, which is natural pest management. There is an FP7 program called Appeal. There is a working group in France which is called SMASH. Many people from the agronomy sector working all together and doing very relevant studies about that. And a week ago, about a week ago, we've been contacted by Cambridge University, the group of conservation evidence of Bill Sutherland, because they just got a grant to do exactly that, to do a review of interventions that are supporting biodiversity, and especially supporting natural predators. So that's a very interesting case study, because that's something we totally forgot in the prototype initially. We forgot, we think that with the prototype we want to collect existing knowledge and synthesize it. But what's going on when you have people currently working on this topic? You shouldn't ignore them. So that's another challenge we haven't anticipated when building up the prototype. But that will be important to put them on board. Or if they are doing something very important, maybe the NoK is not useful, or should delay its conclusion and let them do the work and get back to them. Or, you know, there is much more thinking to put into this prototype, obviously. At this stage of the progression of this case study, obviously we are trying to build up a synergy with Bill Sutherland's approach because it brings some manpower and some structure to what we are doing, and sharing the workload can be very interesting. Bill Sutherland and his team have already identified a list of 30 interventions that are in favor of pest control support. It still needs to be refined, and we still need to share the workload to try to tackle all that. But obviously, it looks like building up a systematic map. So we haven't mentioned what a systematic map is, but it's a part of a systematic review when you have a huge quantity of knowledge and you want to start mapping this knowledge in a systematic way with transparent, replicable, upgradable rules. So you keep this philosophy of systematic reviews, except that you start by mapping the knowledge you have and assessing the quality of the knowledge you have. And then you can identify knowledge gap, or you can identify opportunities to go for a full systematic review by adding a meta-analysis and more conclusions. Because we want to test this NoK prototype, there is something we are trying to do, and I may ask for your help with regards to that. We are trying to create two groups of stakeholders, two groups of extra experts. One is a group of stakeholders, but I think you're all acknowledged as stakeholders already, so we may contact you to have your feedback onto that. But also we're trying to get a group of farmers, because we are very interested in trying to bring on board some kind of traditional knowledge that is not published, to see, based on facts, based on evidence, how we could merge scientific knowledge, or how we could put in parallel scientific knowledge and traditional knowledge based on real case study. So if you know any farmers, I'm much eager to get some emails and help with that, because it's really not easy, except we are going by personal contacts, families and friends and whatever, but that's absolutely not replicable and transparent. So that would need to be improved. And we can foresee that if we are doing well enough and we have very limited resources, because it's a list of interventions, and we are going to assess their efficiency if we can, the adaptive management approach could arrive as a final recommendation when there's not enough evidence. That could be a recommendation to test some of these interventions, but that won't be tested as an approach by itself. 30 seconds, just to finish. What's next? Well, we have to be realistic. That's still a very broad question. We have very limited resources in terms of manpower or woman power. So we need to think exactly how we are going to get organized. The intention is to go back to the virtual requesters to ask them, do they have priorities in terms of crops or pests or pesticides, so that we could narrow this question as much as possible. We need to clarify the collaborations with different people, and we need to keep on working on the draft protocol. And I thank you for your attention, and if you have any question or suggestions, I'm eager to listen with Peter. Thanks.